I'm Catherine Branson. I'm the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission and also the Human Rights Commissioner.
And Catherine, could you briefly tell me why you decided to pursue a career in the law?
Well, it took me some time after I studied law to decide to pursue a career in the law. I think I really made that commitment when I was working in the South Australian Government's law offices. I think that was the first time I'd been working in what was really an equal opportunity workplace, so I felt valued as a lawyer, the same as the other lawyers in the office. And I started to develop there what I still have, which is a real fascination for that relationship, that legal relationship between citizen and state, between those who are governed and those who govern them.
And you've obviously held many prestigious positions. What would you say are your career highlights and why?
Well, I think I'm probably lucky. I've had a few. The first I would have to mention, I think, is the first major appointment I held. I was appointed Crown Solicitor for South Australia and also the Secretary or Permanent Head of the Attorney General's Department of South Australia, as it happened just in the months before I turned 36. Now, this was of course a fantastic opportunity for me, given to me by the Attorney General of the day, Mr. Chris Sumner. It was nerve-wracking for me, I think it probably was for him, but it was a wonderful opportunity to hold what were really very important positions. I think many people at the time thought it was more important to be appointed as Secretary of the Attorney General's Department. Pat O'Shane in New South Wales, who's headed the Aboriginal Affairs Department, was the only woman in Australia at that time who had headed a government department. We didn't have a female head of a federal department until the following year. But for me, I think being appointed Crown Solicitor for South Australia, that is to take on responsibility not only for managing the government's law office, but to be subject to the Solicitor General, the government's chief legal advisor, was a very important thing.
And would you say that you've experienced any setbacks or difficulties on your career path due to your gender?
Yeah. Well, I think I have. I mean, I've been around for a long time, and early on it wasn't really expected that women would be lawyers. There were, of course, some who were setting role models, and in South Australia we had Dame Roma Mitchell. But in fact the numbers had dropped down after the time that she'd been through university. I mean, even my family thought that my law degree would be a good qualification for being a legal secretary. And people were fairly scornful, I think, of the as one senior practitioner said to me, the money wasted by my family on giving me 2 university degrees, because the assumption was that women would only work to fill in time after they left their studies until they married and had children. So I think there were then attitudes that were pretty difficult, that made it difficult for women to do well, particularly in the private profession. And I've already mentioned that I think my career began to develop once I moved out of a private firm into government employ. But I think I'm also of that era that once had enough experience behind me, I think being female might have been an advantage to me. I mean, I've always said that I think I was offered judicial appointment more quickly than a man would have been who'd taken silk at the same time as me. I don't think I was appointed Crown Solicitor for South Australia because I was female, although many other people think I was. But I do believe I moved to the Federal Court more quickly than I would have done had I been a man.
And you're currently President of the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Commissioner. What do these positions mean to you?
Well, look, I think that they're enormously important positions, and that's because of the very important role that I see the Australian Human Rights Commission playing in our democratic nation. It is our national independent human rights institution. So we have an important role to advocate and seek to protect human rights in Australia. And the standards that we work by are the standards set by those international instruments that Australia has become a party to, not all of which are protected in Australia's domestic law. So we, in a sense, try to bridge that gap between Australia's international obligations and the domestic law, and to provide advice to government, but essentially to keep government accountable for the domestic implementation of the responsibilities it's taken on internationally.
And what are the greatest joys associated with your current roles?
Well, there are lots of things that are not joyful, but indeed are grim, that you see when you're with the Australian Human Rights Commission. But we do have little glimpses of joy, and they are what I think keep so many of us going. Incidents like speaking to a child in a schoolyard where bullying is a bit rife, and her explaining to us that she's been able to get her colleagues, those in her classroom with her teacher, to talk about bullying by looking at our website and taking guidance from there. Speaking to a young man who'd been for the first time to a football match by himself because the work of this commission with others had got a public railway line truly accessible to people with wheelchairs. So without assistance he'd been able to leave his home, go to a football match, come back, and wonderful joy was experienced by him. I get lovely feedback about our complaints handling service, both from complainants and respondents, about the sympathetic but dispassionate but very professional way in which their complaint has been handled. Often not so that not only is the individual complaint resolved, but there can be structural change, in a workplace, in an industry, in one case making all public parks in a local government area accessible to people with disability. These are wonderfully encouraging and joyful things to happen.
And how would you define leadership, and how would you describe yourself as a leader?
Well, leadership, it's a difficult and a sort of intangible thing. I tend to think of it in two ways. I think one is institutional leadership, and I think to provide that you've got to have a very clear idea, in the case of a Human Rights Commission, about what a really well-functioning, well-operating Human Rights Commission would look like, and then have some sense of the steps that would be needed to take your institution to that place, and a capacity to work and draw on the skills of others to move your institution to that place. Personal leadership, I tend to think much more, although the two are obviously connected, to be about the model you set for those who work for you, the model about commitment, respect for the values you stand for, hard work. I think for the leader, a willingness to make hard decisions when they need to be made, but to make them through fair process. I think to be seen to stand for the things that you value, to be concerned for respect, and less concerned perhaps to be loved.
What do you see as being the primary challenges facing the legal profession today?
The challenges facing the legal profession, I think, are the same all of the time. And that is the big challenge of maintaining the confidence and respect of the people that the courts are serving and the legal profession is serving. I'd like to speak particularly about the courts because that's my most recent experience in the legal profession. The courts have to maintain the confidence of everyone in our diverse society that their processes are fair, that they're respectful of the people involved, that the decisions have integrity, and that everyone in the community with a legal dispute can find a court to access where the costs are proportionate to the dispute that they have, the formality is proportionate to the dispute that they have. So the court you might need, if you're having a dispute with your neighbour about your adjoining fence, needs to be a court fairly cheap, one that will resolve your dispute quite quickly and quite informally. If you happen to be a major international company and you're litigating with another one about a matter of major commercial significance, or you're fighting with the government about a matter of very high constitutional principle, you expect more formality. I think you've got to expect that it will be more expensive, and the court will need to take probably a longer period of time to deal with that dispute in the way that it deserves. Everywhere you need proportionate response to the problems that the members of the public face.
And how would you describe the current state of human rights in Australia?
Well, we're all pretty lucky to live in Australia. Most of us live a very comfortable life, and our civil rights, our civil and political rights are not in much danger. But that doesn't mean that we can be confident throughout our entire lifespan that our rights will be respected, and we can't be confident that there are not marginalised and vulnerable people in our society whose rights are not respected. So, most of us will age. Tragically, some of us won't last that long, but the bulk of us will age. And as we age, we'll become infirm, both physically and some of us mentally. We can't yet be confident that our rights will be truly respected when we have disability. For the same reasons, those who have lived with disability throughout their lives still face exclusion from some parts of our public life. We know that women disproportionately to men experience financial difficulties in their mature years. We know that the gap of disadvantage between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and the Australian mainstream is far too wide. We have to deal with that. And we do have vulnerable people, including children, living in our immigration detention facilities. And this is something of which I think we can't be proud as a nation.